Hello, I'm Pastor Luke Nagy of the Bryan First Brethren Church, and this is video number 3 of our church membership class, our online church membership class. And this is what membership is at Bryan First Brethren Church. If you remember right, I said that there were going to be 4 main teaching parts of these membership classes. Part 1, which we did yesterday, is what membership even is. What are we talking about when we talk about membership? What does that mean? And today, we're talking about what membership is specifically here at Bryan First Brethren Church. And then tomorrow, we're going to talk about duties, responsibilities, kind of the nitty-gritty. Not necessarily what membership is in a kind of a grand sense, but kind of getting down to the what the responsibilities, the roles, the duties, expectations are, things like that. And number 4, the 4th video, is what is the Brethren Church? So getting really specific, not even talking about this church, but kind of the Brethren Church in what that even is. If you're going to join a Brethren Church, you probably want to know something and probably should know something about the Brethren Church. So today, to do this discussion, I'm going to talk about basically who's a member at our church, what membership is, and then talk about kind of some theological implications of that, and some things that I think need to be clarified based upon the definition that we have of membership. The definition is actually packed with a lot of really rich and good stuff, but it's stuff that needs to be unpacked. So first of all, what you need to know is at First Brethren Church, there are 3 categories of people. If you attend this church, I mean, really technically, even if you don't attend this church, there are 3 categories of people. There are non-members, and you don't even have to go to this church to be a non-member. You right now may be a non-member of this church and not even know it. But non-members are everybody who's not a member. So that's everybody. Then there are active members, which are members who are in every way, fulfilling their duties towards the church, and are attending regularly. And then there are inactive members, and those are members who tend to be members who are attending a different church for, maybe they're married and they didn't want to drop their membership yet because they're looking at a different church, and they're kind of like, oh, well, I just got married. Am I gonna go to his church? Am I gonna go to her church? Or are we gonna settle here? And so that would be a legitimate time to put somebody on an inactive status. We're not going to revoke your membership, but if you're church shopping because of a legitimate reason, like you got married or you just moved, we're not going to take you off the rolls, but you probably should take a settle down from maybe some of the voting things and other things that go along with membership. Another time when people would be put on an inactive membership role would be if they are snowbirds or they're big vacationers and you're gone for an extended period of time. We would put you on an inactive status. That doesn't mean that we don't love you. It doesn't mean that you're not part of our church family. It just means that for that period, you're not an active member. You're not fulfilling those duties of an active member. Now, obviously, people can lose their membership. We'll talk about that here in a little bit, and that is a rather serious thing and something we do take seriously. This isn't a marriage. People can remove themselves from membership. They can do that if they move or choose another church, or various reasons, good and bad, why people may have their membership revoked, or why they may surrender their membership or cancel their membership. So there are all kinds of reasons for that as well. But those 3 categories aside, we'll talk more about those 3 categories tomorrow when we have the time. But for right now, I want us to just look at the definition of member based upon our church constitution. A member is defined in our constitution as membership, rather. I'm sorry. A member would be a person who lives up to these standards. But membership is a public declaration of commitment to the ministry of the Bryan First Brethren Church. It is open to those who confess faith in Jesus Christ, are baptized by believers' baptism, agree to the brethren tenets of faith, and serve within its constitution and bylaws. Therefore, members are people who have made a public declaration of commitment to the ministry of Bryan First Brethren Church, and who have confessed faith in Jesus Christ, are baptized by believers' baptism. They agree to the tenets of the Brethren tenets of faith and serve within its constitution and bylaws. So I want to start right now with probably the most important part of this entire definition, really the most important part of this entire video, is this first this first statement. Membership is a public declaration of commitment to the ministry of First Brethren Church. There are three key components to this definition. It's got to be a public declaration, it's a commitment, and it's a commitment to somebody. So you're declaring something. You're not declaring bankruptcy. You're not going to stand up and declare bankruptcy, but you're declaring something. You're making a declaration. You're making a statement to the public. It's a public declaration. It's not a private declaration. It's not, you're not writing Dear Diary, I really love First Brethren Church. No, you're making a public declaration so other people can know, and it's a declaration that something has happened, that you're doing something, that you are making a commitment to the ministry of the Bryan First Brethren Church. Now, that's a little bit wordy, not bad, but wordy, and it needs some thought. We need to consider this. There is a really, really bad habit that goes on in American churches, and I'm sure you've heard the term. It's called church hopping. It is the bane of pastors. It is the bane of churches that are working on trying to build solid commitment and growth. It is not a good thing, and it is something that is to be discouraged, and something that really is to be exposed as a toxic behavior. Church hopping is not good. It's not healthy. It does not create strong, healthy congregations, and frankly, it is not conducive to a strong, healthy Christian life. Are there reasons to leave churches? Absolutely there are. There are certainly reasons to leave churches. There are certainly legitimate reasons, by the way, legitimate reasons to leave churches. But that's not what church hopping is. Church hopping is not being a member of a church or going to a church or making a commitment to a church, whatever term you want to use, for an extended period of time, and then there is an open heresy in the church, or you move, or you get married and join somebody else's church, or the church disbands or dissolves, or you have a major change in your own theological beliefs and you want to attend a church that more closely aligns with that faith. All of those, I think, are legitimate reasons. The last one probably being the one that I find the weakest argument, but it's an argument. Okay, some wrong reasons to leave churches. Some wrong reasons are: I don't really like the music. I don't like the pastor's message. I'm not being fed. Now, is not being fed the Word of God a legitimate concern? Sure. And does that happen? Yes. Is that typically what people mean when they say I'm not being fed? No, typically when people say I'm not being fed, what they mean is the pastor's preaching solid biblical truth that can transform my life, but I don't particularly like his or her delivery, and so I'm saying I'm not fed. Most of the time, not always, most of the time when people say I'm not being fed, that's a you problem, not a pastor problem. Pastors have their own problems, one of which is teaching false or heretical doctrine, and if that's happening, you absolutely should leave. If you are part of a church that is not preaching and teaching the Bible faithfully, then you should absolutely leave. If you're part of a church that really is doing a very bad job of providing for the unity of the Holy Spirit, there's constant conflict and aggression. You have infighting, and it's really hindering the work of the Spirit. That's a legitimate reason to leave. But those are very limited circumstances, and most people that we would call church hoppers, they're not leaving for those reasons. They're leaving because they've got their their interests or whatever, and they're leaving. And I want to strongly discourage church hopping. If you're a person who's gone to, 9 churches in the last 6 years, probably membership here isn't really for you. Probably membership anywhere isn't really for you. And forgive me for saying this, but if you're a person who's a perpetual church hopper, just stop. Just stop. Are there legitimate reasons to leave churches? Absolutely. And I will defend very strongly people who have left churches for legitimate reasons. There are people who are mistreated by their churches, and leaving when you're mistreated by a church is absolutely legitimate. But not every time people leave, it's legitimate. And so if you're a person who church hops, especially if you're a person who church hops with small children, you need to stop, because you're harming your faith, you're harming your soul, and you're harming their souls. You're also, if you're making membership commitments, you're also violating your word, which is something we should take seriously. Like, when you make a commitment to a church, you're making a covenant with those people. You're promising, you're making a declaration of something, and you really shouldn't take that flippantly or lightly. You should take that quite seriously. Whenever you make a public commitment, you should hold that commitment as, if not sacred, extremely seriously. Because membership is not simply your public declaration. It's also the congregation's public declaration. And I'm going to get to that right next. You make a declaration to a church and to its ministries. That's how we're defining membership. Membership is a public declaration of commitment to the ministry of Bryan First Brethren Church. So this is you saying, I'm committing to Bryan FBC. I'm committing my time, talent, treasure. I am committing to serve and be served within this particular iteration of the body of Christ. You should take that seriously. And that means you have to put up with some stuff. Ask any pastor. Ask any pastor. If you're going to be a member of a church, you're going to have to put up with some stuff. You're going to be wronged. If you are in the church and you are never wronged by anybody, you're probably not interacting with anybody, because that's human nature. We rub up against each other. We wrong each other. I wrong people. People have wronged me. We have to learn to have grace and receive grace, to forgive and be forgiven. We need to learn those things. But that is what membership is. Now, that is the you side, the person who wants to become a member side. The church side and the pastor side, or in other churches, they have other, they may not have a pastor, they may have an elder board, or they may have other specific, a diaconal board that assesses these things. But here at First Brethren Church, predominantly it is my responsibility as the pastor to evaluate these claims for membership. Our administrative board, which we'll talk about later, also has some oversight into that as well. But our membership is open to people who are able to do these things: confess faith in Jesus Christ, are baptized by believers' baptism, agree to the brethren tenets of faith, and serve within our constitution and bylaws. Confess faith in Jesus Christ, are baptized by believers' baptism, agree to the brethren tenets of faith, and serve within our constitution and bylaws. So the first part, and remember, this is the our side, right? This is the Brethren, First Brethren Church side. This is for us to assess. You can come and make a public declaration of commitment to our church, but we have to accept that public declaration. It's kind of like marriage, right? Like, if you want to get married to the pretty girl, you can't just walk up and say, I marry you, as if you're calling dibs, right? She has a say in it as well. You can't just show up at a football game and say, we win. The other team gets a vote. They get an opportunity to respond. You don't just say, I win the game. That it would it'd be an interesting concept. I don't think people would be very interested in watching it, but it'd be fun. The church has a say. We get a say, and we have a responsibility, and it's a quite high responsibility, right? Because when we accept somebody in membership, we are making a acknowledgement that somebody is a believer and somebody is a serious believer. Okay? When somebody comes and says, I want to become a member, and we say, yes, you've fulfilled these four major criteria, a credible, I'm adding this word, but it's implicit, and I can show you from our Constitution why it needs to be there. But a credible confession of faith in Jesus Christ, a valid baptism by believers' baptism, that they've agreed to the brethren tenets of faith and they're serving within its constitution and bylaws, we're saying you've done those things. When we accept you and receive you into membership, we're affirming that. We're affirming your confession of faith. We're affirming your baptism. We're affirming that you are living according to our tenets of faith and that you're serving within our constitution and bylaws. That's the us side. Now, what does it mean? I said credible confession of faith. Now, if you remember, I mentioned this yesterday. There was a scholar I quoted who talked about this, a credible profession of faith or a credible declaration of faith, however you want to phrase it. Why do I add that word credible? Well, because everybody and their brother knows that there are people out there claiming to be Christians who are absolutely not Christians. The claim to faith has to be credible. It has to be believable. Now, notice what I didn't say. I didn't say a certain profession of faith, a certain confession of faith, a certain declaration of faith. I said a credible declaration of faith. There's a very, 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 very big difference between making a certain, from the witness's side, a certain declaration of faith and a credible declaration of faith. The profession of faith has to be credible. It has to be believable. Now you say, well, Luke, that's a rather loose standard. Who determines whether it's believable? I do. I decide. And I have standards by which I can help assess that. But somebody has to decide. And if you just let anybody become a member because they make the declaration, well, then you've got chaos, right? There is this constant battle within church structures. And all those books right there, and then a bunch of them right there, are on the topic of what's called ecclesiology. Ecclesiology, I mentioned this before, is the conversations about the ecclesia, the church. If you speak Spanish, église, or iglesia. In French, it's église. This idea of what the church is. We're discussing this. This question is crucial to the question of ecclesiology, of who gets to say, how are we kind of minding the margins? How are we watching the gates and the barriers? Are we being completely open? Are we being completely closed? How do we balance the need to be open to new believers and to show grace and forgiveness and allow people to start over and experience the joy of renewal in Christ, while also having standards that don't allow it to be an anything goes nightmare? This, by the way, this shows up not just in ecclesiology. This shows up in pretty much all the humanities disciplines. The struggle between formulaism and a rigid structuralism that really doesn't work and anything goes chaos. Our duty, my duty as a pastor, and somebody's got to make these decisions, my duty as the pastor is to assess somebody's claim and decide, is this a credible claim to faith? Now, obviously, I'm a fallible person, and so if our deacons or board were to say, no, Luke, you've got this one wrong, certainly that would be taken quite seriously, and we would have to reassess at that point, because if everybody's saying I'm wrong but me, I'm probably wrong, right? The odds that everybody's wrong and you're right is pretty low. So we would reassess at that point. But it's important to recognize that your faith, your confession of faith, has to be credible. It has to be believable. And we're going to use the tools at our disposal to assess whether it's believable. Do you make a reasonable claim? Can you articulate your faith? Can you talk about the core ideas of the Christian faith? Can you do that? Can you articulate what saving faith is? If not, we're going to have some questions. Are you living in accordance with the gospel as befits a person who's been a believer for as long as you've been? That's a serious question. Now, we don't expect old heads on young shoulders, right? I understand that spiritual maturation is a process of maturation. I don't expect the 17-year-old who just got saved to behave the same way as the 70-year-old who's been a believer since he was 17. We have different expectations for people based upon how long they've been a Christian. That's what you expect in a process of maturation. Spiritual babies are not treated the same way as spiritual elders. However, we still have expectations. There are still things that you would require of someone to say, for us to confirm your faith. Because if we tell somebody, we just don't know if your claim to faith is credible, we're not saying you're not a believer. We don't get to pick who goes to heaven or hell. That's clearly not what's going on. What we're saying is you need to demonstrate with better evidence that your claim to faith is legitimate. Because from where we're sitting, we cannot. And by the way, this happened to D.L. Moody. D.L. Moody got saved, and he wanted to be baptized, and the people, the baptism committee at his church said that they didn't think he understood the faith adequately. And to his dying day, Moody never criticized those men for doing it. He says they were right to do it. They were right to deny me baptism because I didn't truly understand the faith. And that brings me to my next point, which is all still within this, confession of faith and in Jesus Christ. You say, well, Luke, what am I got to take do I got to take a theology exam? No, you don't. You don't have to take one to be baptized here either. But there is going to be a conversation about what you actually believe. All the people I've baptized in my life have been people, and we've had a hard conversation about what you believe, what you know, and is there evidence in your life? Because if I'm going to baptize you, or if somebody in our church, another deacon or leader in the church is going to baptize you, we want to know that we are not giving you false hope. We are not making a public confirmation of a faith that may not be real. We have a duty. We have a duty to protect the ordinances or sacraments of the church, to not allow them to be sullied, to not allow them to be used vainly. That's a serious responsibility. That's something that I take seriously, and I would certainly hope, and I absolutely believe, everybody else in this church takes seriously. We don't treat the holy things as though they were profane. We don't share the cup of Christ in the cup of demons. We don't treat holy things as though they were unholy. We don't cast pearls before swine. If you cannot make a credible profession of faith, we're not going to baptize you, and you're not going to become a member here. That doesn't mean you're not a believer. We could be wrong. But maybe that ought to be an opportunity for you to say, wow, I really ought to make sure I get this a little better. Now, this points to a problem, and this is a problem that the Brethren Church has, and that when I've been a pastor at Mennonite churches have this problem. Lots of Baptist churches have this problem. Pretty much all the free churches have this problem, and that is a lack of catechism, a lack of catechesis. If you were to look at the Brethren Church's documents, and by the way, I want to be extremely clear, this is not me bashing the Brethren Church. What I'm saying is we have different values, and we have historically expressed those values differently, and this leads to different results. The Brethren Church is not the Baptist Church, is not the Bulgarian Orthodox Church. They're not the same. And so our expressions of faith come out differently. But that doesn't mean that we can't learn from other people. Should the Bulgarian Orthodox Church learn from the Brethren Church? Absolutely. There's a lot to learn. Should we learn some things from them? Yeah, we should. One of the things that evangelical churches, not just the Brethren Church, by the way, pretty much all the evangelical churches, and if you talk to any evangelical theologian, they will tell you this, we are sorely lacking in catechesis. If you look at this book, this is called Brethren Beliefs. This was published a long time ago. And here is the slightly newer version of Brethren Beliefs. If you become a member, the church will purchase you one of these. This is our Brethren Beliefs, right? Is 48 pages, written like this. This is the size of my hand. So it's 8 inches. I was a carpenter for a long time. That's a little over 8, so about 9 inches. 9 by 6. 48 pages of 9 by 6. And it's at least double spaced, which is great because you can make notes. Big font, lots of white space on this paper, right? 48 pages. This is the core of the Brethren faith. Remember when I read that statement that you agree with the Brethren tenets of faith? That's this. That's this, the Brethren beliefs, the centennial statement of the Brethren Church. Those are our core beliefs. Let's compare. This is the Catechism of the Catholic Church. This is, not counting the indices, okay, we're not going to count the index, that'd be cheating, right? But if you actually look at the direct teaching, you have 756 pages. Again, you have about 8 by 5, slightly smaller book, right? But look at how it's arranged. Look at how it's organized, right? Very dense pages. And you can read these pages pretty quickly if you're so inclined, but very, very dense. This is the Book of Concord, the Lutheran document, okay? If not counting the indices, if you want to pronounce it that way. And there's a lot of, this is a really nice version, by the way, so there are a lot of photos, a lot of pictures, a lot of great helps and commentary in this, so this isn't a perfect example, but if you skip the photo part, right, and you just look at the actual teachings. Nope, we don't want any appendices either. No appendices. We only want the actual teaching part. You've got about 618, 19 pages. 620 pages. Okay? Look at these pages. Look at these bad boys right here. Oh, yeah, look at that. Look at that. I'm messing up my light. Oh my gosh. You got at least 9 inches, 9 by 7.5. Huge pages. Huge font. Look at this. Compare these. Let's compare these. Right? Side by side comparison. Yeah. Get a page that actually has something on it. Okay. Look at this. 620:48. Okay. This is not me criticizing the Brethren Church. I'm not criticizing at all. This is not me saying, oh, the Roman Catholics are awesome. That's not what I'm doing. What I'm saying is, our churches, evangelical churches are far from the only ones. The Brethren Church is not the only one. The Mennonite Confession of Faith and Mennonite Perspective are roughly the same size as this. Okay? Those teachings are very limited for a very specific reason. And the reason is that the Brethren churches and a lot of evangelical churches want to major on the majors. They are allergic to really complex theological arrangements called creeds, or these really long, complex catechisms. The reason is because when you look back at the Reformation period and you look at the incredibly complex systems of theology that were developed by not just the Catholic Church, but the Reformers, you see how you could be offended by this, how there were Christians murdering Christians because they disagreed about baptism. There were Christians killing Christians because they disagreed about the doctrine of justification. There is a reason why the leaders of the Brethren Church wanted to reject these man-made creeds. And there's a reason why that has affected the Brethren Church ever since. And in fact, the Brethren Encyclopedia, which is right here, when you look under catechism, it says this. Catechisms. Brethren have not utilized formal catechisms, although Alexander Mack Sr. used a quasi-catechetical, that means in the form of a catechism, question and answer format as a literary device in Rechte und Ordnungen, Rights and Ordinances. A catechism is found in the manuscripts of Alexander Mack Jr. It is not known how it was used. Brethren parents were encouraged to instruct their children at home. With the acceptance of Sunday schools, curriculum materials were developed for all ages. Baptismal instruction was also gradually formalized until, in the latter 20th century, many congregations periodically have a membership class or a pastor's class to instruct young people and others seeking baptisms or preparing to become members of the congregation, etc., etc. Point being, the focus was not on these enormous, complex theological treatises. It was not on these long, exhaustive catechisms. The focus was decidedly not that, because it was feared that speaking with certainty on issues where you couldn't have certainty would lead to violence. And frankly, that's true. The Western Christian church has speculative dogmatism bred into its bones. By that I mean the Western Christian church likes to speculate about things and then get really dogmatic about it. Like really just like hold the line. This is a hill. Well, I'm not willing to die on this hill, but you're going to die. I'm willing for you to die on this hill. That's the attitude. That's what's happened within Western Christendom. And the Brethren Church, largely rightly, almost entirely rightly, has rejected that. Now, has it gone, would I argue that it's gone a little bit too far? Yes, and the Brethren Encyclopedia even points this out. If you look up the article on creeds, it's like, well, we say we don't believe in creeds, but that's kind of a bumper sticker slogan. We have creeds, right? But we want to be very limited in what we want to be minimalist in what we affirm dogmatically. We want to be minimalist in what we affirm dogmatically. But what that has meant, and lots of other evangelical churches are like that, by the way. Lots of evangelical churches are minimalist in their doctrine. They want to be minimalist in what they affirm and insist upon dogmatically. What this means is, for a whole variety of reasons, our churches don't have catechisms. What was expected is exactly what I just read. Parents would instruct children. There was a presupposition of natural family growth. Why? Because where and when did the Brethren Church form? Oh, early 1700s in Germany. Who wasn't a Christian? How many Jews were there? I mean, there were some, but not a lot. How many Hindus? None. How many Buddhists? Zero. How many open atheists? I mean, a few, but they were few and far between. This faith came out of a thoroughly Christianized society where everybody was at least nominally Christian. America, until like 50, 60 years ago, everybody was at least nominally Christian, right? Catechism started, if you remember the video yesterday, catechism started when the Christian church began to grow in heavily paganized areas where people didn't have an Old Testament background. And they needed to be taught the faith before they could be received as members through baptism, before they could be received as, they were baptismal candidates, but they were catechumens. They were people undergoing a process of catechesis. And that took 3 years at its height. Why? Because people were coming out of a pagan background. They had to be disabused of their paganism. They had to learn the Christian way of life, and they had to demonstrate the validity of their faith. That they weren't going to knuckle under as soon as their life was in jeopardy. When you live in an entirely Christianized society, the need for catechism is still there, but it's much less. And you can anticipate and expect that through the process of simply absorbing it through your environment, you can absorb a lot of these Christian presuppositions. That's not the case. That's growing to be less and less of the case every single day here in America. Now, there is a resurgence of Christian faith in America, and we'll see what happens with that. But right now, there are lots and lots of people who don't know a thing. There are people who've never cracked open a Bible. There are people who don't know a single character. If you ask them who Adam and Eve is, they really legitimately wouldn't know. So catechism, helping people to understand the basics of the faith, is growing increasingly important as America and the West become increasingly post-Christian. As society becomes less Christian, the need for a formal teaching of the faith becomes more important. Does this mean that the brethren were wrong all those years for not having catechism? No. What I'm saying is, what I believe, and what if you talk to any evangelical theologian, well, I shouldn't say any, there are probably some who disagree, but you talk to any evangelical theologian in the circles I run in, they're all going to say, man, evangelicals, we've got to figure out a way to do catechism. We've got to formally and systematically train our people in the faith, and Sundays ain't doing it. Because we want people to know the faith. Theology's awesome. It's great. It's wonderful. Actually knowing what you believe is amazing. It's great. It's wonderful. And there are things that we really have to know, because one, it's just good to know. But two, when we don't formally faith, we invite error, we invite heresy, and we invite people to live disastrous mistakes in their life. People make a shipwreck of their faith because they don't know the faith. So this is something we've all got to do better at. I include myself. This is something I've been working on, something I've been trying to do. And you know, I want there to be more of this formal teaching of the faith, systematic formal teaching of the faith. But it's just really hard to know where to start, to know where to go. But getting back to the point, I know I rambled a little bit. But I think it was all good stuff. I think. I have to see a credible profession of faith. When you say, I believe in Jesus Christ, I'm probably going to ask some follow-up questions. Like, what does that mean? Who is Jesus to you? What is salvation? Like I said, this isn't going to be a theology exam, but I need to be sure that your confession of faith is credible. Okay? You're baptized by believers' baptism. This is a crucial one. This is really at the core and the heart of what the Brethren Church is, does, and believes. The Brethren Church, if you remember, I mentioned this before, the Brethren Church is this attempt to be the third way between pietism and Anabaptism, particularly the Mennonite form of Anabaptism. What does that mean, Luke? What does that mean? Well, pietism is a form of Christianity. It was very popular in late 17th, early 18th century Germany, even into the early 19th century, right? Extremely popular form of Christianity. The Moravians were this highly affected and influenced John Wesley. I turned influence and affected into infected. That's not what I meant. Although, it's not entirely wrong. Wesley was strongly influenced by the Pietist movement. The Moravians, he went to Herrnhut, which was kind of this leader, this center of Moravian thought. And the Moravian Pietists had a whole series of beliefs. I'm not going to go into them today, but what they really wanted to do was emphasize the need for the Spirit's power in Christian life and in the way the church ordered itself. The Moravian movement really was tired of dead formalism. This is, by the way, if you're interested in philosophy, Soren Kierkegaard, he writes a lot about this, right? Soren Kierkegaard, the melancholy Dane, great philosopher, extremely difficult to read, but you can probably read a summary of this stuff and get quite a bit out of it. But there was this recognition that Reformed Christianity, Lutheran, Calvinist, and other forms of Christianity, not just those, but those in particular, had really fallen into kind of a dead formalism, into a process of box ticking, and it was so intellectual, it was so heady, so formal, but there was very little actual demonstration of the Spirit and power. And what the Pietists wanted to do was to seek piety, to live a pious life, a life influenced by the Spirit, where doctrine would not be the end result of speculation by a philosopher, but would be guided by the Spirit. They really longed for the Spirit to guide and direct everything they did. Now, on the other side, that's one side, the Pietist movement. On the other side, you have the Anabaptist movement, particularly the Mennonites. The Mennonites were largely influenced by this book. You probably can't read that. This is the complete writings of Menno Simons. Menno Simons, right? That's where it comes from. Menno Simons, particularly, probably his most famous work is Foundations on Christian Doctrine. Incidentally, if anybody's out there and you feel particularly generous and you want to contribute to the Luke Nagy Library Fund, I would love a new copy of the complete works of Menno Simons. This one is falling apart. You can probably hear it. Listen to that. Listen to the sweet, sweet sounds of breaking binding. Maybe I should just get it rebound. Anyways, I'm not a rich man. But Menno wrote a lot of excellent stuff. Menno's writings changed my life. He's not always the easiest guy to read. But in fairness, he was running for his life almost his entire life. So I think we can cut him some slack. But what the Anabaptists believed was that the Spirit and the Word had been revealed through the Scripture. The Spirit's message had been revealed through the Scripture, and that through a right reading of Scripture, that with the right reading of Scripture, the right exercise of the sacraments, and right church discipline, the Anabaptists are really heavy on this one, the right exercise of church discipline, the church could be restored back to its apostolic glory. That there was enough of it's called the apostolic deposit. That's a technical term. The deposit of faith, what the apostles had left behind, was strongly given sufficiently in the Bible that we could have confidence in understanding the faith. And they really wanted to reform the church. The Anabaptist movement was largely not a big theological movement. The Anabaptist movement had grown. The Mennonite church had grown. And they rejected infant baptism. They rejected popes. They rejected this archbishopric structure, this heavy hierarchy structure. And they had changed a lot of things, and they were getting murdered left, right, and center. But the Mennonite church, the Anabaptist movement, did have a big problem, which was their insistence upon the ban, which was a form of excommunication, was so heavy-handed that it turned a lot of people off. And the Anabaptist movement had also gotten really strong into making really firm creedal statements about speculative things. And that really turned off Alexander Mack and a lot of the people that helped form the Brethren Church. And they said, well, we want both. We want the best of both. We want the strong ecclesiology and we want the strong soteriology that the Anabaptists offer us. But we also don't want to be bound by a lot of their formalism, because in many ways, the Anabaptists were just as formal, if not more formal, than the Lutherans and the Catholics. They were just a lot less murdery about it. And so the Brethren Church wanted to kind of have the best of both worlds, and that was really their attempt, was to mix and fuse pietism and Anabaptism. And that's their great experiment, is Word and the Spirit. But they affirmed baptism. They affirmed believers' baptism. And like I said, the Anabaptist movement, it's in the name. Anabaptism means rebaptized. They were rebaptizers. And, right here, I mentioned this yesterday, the Martyr's Mirror. I don't speak Dutch, but the Dutch title is Der Bloody Toneel. But this book right here, you can read, is it's a big book of martyrs. And this has trial records. This has the records of deaths. There are also some really beautiful woodcut illustrations. Often they're quite horrendous woodcut illustrations, but you get the point. This is the Martyr's Mirror. This was standard reading in the Mennonite Church for a really, really long time. It's kind of fallen out of favor. People don't read it because frankly, it's extremely difficult reading. But it talks about the deaths of sometimes hundreds, even thousands at a time, in these horrendous persecutions of the Anabaptists. But their goal was not, they refused to accept their infant baptism because they believed that the Bible clearly taught that you get baptized on a profession of faith. And the Anabaptists did that, and that's why they were called rebaptizers. And they were like, no, that wasn't my infant baptism was not a legitimate baptism, but they're like, no, you're Anabaptists. And when they would drown them, sometimes they would throw them in a sack and drown them, they would call that their third baptism. They were really clever with the way they murdered people back then. So that's how they did. Now, we say in our church that you have to be baptized by believers' baptism. And remember I talked about catechesis, right? You had to have in the old church, you had to have catechism, sometimes up to 3 years before you would be accepted as baptism. We don't require a catechism, but we do have an interview, at least one interview that we're going to do before we accept you as a candidate for baptism, because we want to confirm that your profession of faith is something that we believe is credible. And there are two schools of thought on this, right? On one school of thought is, well, read the Bible. Philip baptized the Ethiopian eunuch, and he didn't do any catechism. Right, well, Philip accepted his confession of faith as credible. On the other hand, the early church recognized, man, this is something we better take seriously. And so they did. This is how our church balances this. We entrust the pastor and the leaders of the church to determine whether or not somebody's confession of faith is credible. That's how we do. I certainly think that there's a lot to the argument of requiring catechism before. Absolutely. If you want to make that argument and your church does that, good. Yeah, makes sense. If you don't want to do that and you don't want to fence the baptismal font that strongly, I also absolutely, you've got a great biblical argument. There are times in life where both people can be right. Like both sides are right. Like there are good reasons for doing both. You should probably do one that's consistent with the rest of your faith. And you say, well, Luke, that's not a very courageous answer. That's a cowardly answer. No, it's an answer that I'm quite confident in. Two people can say different things and still be right. Like that's a verse of the Bible that if it doesn't trouble you yet, it probably will trouble you someday. When Paul is talking to people and he says, yeah, we disagree about this, and I think I too have the Spirit of God. People who have the Spirit of God can disagree about stuff. That's possible. If you're looking for certainty, it's probably not very comforting, but it's possible. We also want you to agree with the brethren tenets of faith. We're going to talk about this in probably in 2 days. I'm going to go over the brethren tenets of faith and what that is, what that means, and really discuss that in detail, because that's important to understand what you're actually saying you affirm. And finally, serve within this church's constitution and bylaws. You can't just do whatever you want. You've got to follow the rules. Everybody's got rules they have to follow, including me, including you. But I really wanted to focus on confession of faith, a credible confession of faith, and baptism by believers' baptism. If you're interested in any of these resources, I would highly recommend reading Menno Simon's his Foundation on Christian Doctrine. I would highly recommend reading the Centennial Statement of the Brethren Church. These are all available for free online. And if you want more resources, I am absolutely available all the time. I can give you more resources if you want. If you want more to read. And then obviously I have, a pretty decent library. Need a new one of these. Remember, if you're feeling generous, feeling giving, need a new one of those. But I've got, my library is always open to members of this church. As long as it's not a book I need right now, people are always welcome to borrow books. But anyways, I will be back tomorrow, and we will talk about duties and responsibilities and expectations by and of members at First Brethren Church. And I can't wait till we see you then. And if you have been watching these videos and you're interested in membership, you just got 2 videos left. And then you will have fulfilled the video portion of your membership requirements. And as long as you meet our other criteria, you can become a member. So anyways, until then, may God richly bless you, my beloved.